I was kneeling on the damp grass when it happened, my jeans soaked through at the knees and my hands trembling so violently that the streaks of dried blood along my knuckles looked like cracks running through old porcelain. The late afternoon sky above Ridgewood Estate had gone a heavy, unbroken gray, the kind that presses down on everything beneath it, and for a moment I could not tell if the chill in my body came from the cold ground or from the shock that had hollowed out my breath. In front of me, leaning back against the weathered stone of the old fountain, sat Ariel Harrington, the 18-year-old daughter of the billionaire who owned the land I worked on. She was barefoot, her pale hair clinging to her cheeks, her chest rising and falling in startled bursts. But what froze me in place was her expression. Her eyes were wide, not with fear but with something close to awe, a kind of wonder so raw it almost looked like pain. A single tear slid down her cheek as she lifted her face toward the canopy of trees above us as if the world had suddenly begun speaking to her after a lifetime of silence. And then I heard it, the softest sound, a breathy, uncertain gasp. But it came from her, from a girl who had never heard anything in all the years she had lived. Just moments earlier, she had been clutching her ear, her face twisted in agony, her body shaking in a silence deeper and heavier than I could ever imagine. And now she was looking at me as though she were hearing my breath, my heartbeat, my name. Something inside me cracked open at that look, something I did not know I had been carrying. It was not gratitude I saw on her face. It was not fear. It was recognition, as though she sensed that I had crossed a line I was never meant to cross. In the back of my mind, a warning rang out sharp and cold, the same warning I had been given on my first week working here. You are never allowed to touch her. Those words echoed like footsteps in a deserted hallway. But rules are easy to follow until someone is crying in front of you, shaking, hurting, and no one else is there to help. In that moment, I had not seen a billionaire's daughter. I had not seen the heir to a fortune or the girl surrounded by guards and walls and rules. I had only seen a young woman in pain, desperate for relief from something no one had taken the time to understand. My breath came too fast, too loud. I could hear the thumping in my chest as if it were trying to punch its way out. Part of me wanted to step back and pretend none of this had happened, that her world had not shifted because of something I had done. I wanted to run, to hide from the consequences I knew were coming. But then she turned her face fully toward me, her eyes softening, her lips parting as if she were trying to understand the new sounds traveling through the air. A bird called from high above the fountain, a bright, clean note that sliced through the heavy gray afternoon. Ariel's head snapped upward. She gasped again, louder this time, and pressed her hand to her chest as if she could feel the sound echoing inside her. She heard it. She truly heard it. My throat tightened, and for a second I thought I might collapse. How had this happened? How had I, a 22-year-old gardener with nothing but a pair of work gloves and a second-hand truck to my name, become the first person to bring sound into her silent world? How did someone like me, someone who lived paycheck to paycheck, end up kneeling in the grass with the truth of her entire life resting in my shaking palms? Because I could still feel it, the weight of the thing I had pulled from her ear only moments earlier. The dark obstruction no doctor had ever seen, no specialist, had ever removed the thing that had caused her years of pain and stolen her chance to hear the world. It had slid free with a resistance that made my heart nearly stop, and when it landed in my hand, slick and heavy, I knew instantly that everything had changed. Fear surged through me, cold and clear. I had touched her. I had broken every rule this estate lived by. If anyone had seen us, if anyone understood what I had done, my job would be gone before the hour was over. Grant Harrington would have me dragged off the property, and maybe worse. But then Ariel looked at me again, her eyes bright with something like joy, and the fear cracked inside me. She whispered a sound fragile and trembling but real, and that sound pierced straight through my chest. In that moment, I understood the truth I had no way to escape. I pulled something out of her ear, something no doctor saw, something that changed everything. Ridgewood Estate was the kind of place people in my hometown whispered about, the kind of place you only saw in magazines laid out in waiting rooms or in commercials for luxury cars. The first time I drove through the wrought iron gates, I thought I had taken a wrong turn into another world. Acres of grass rolled out in every direction, trimmed so precisely that even the morning dew seemed to land in neat, obedient rows. The lawns stretched wide like golf courses, dipping and rising in perfect curves, designed by someone who believed nature looked best when it behaved. Beyond them were the rose gardens arranged in symmetrical patterns that took 3 full maps to understand, and dotted with marble statues imported from Italy, each one carved with a face that looked like it had never known hardship. I tended those gardens 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, shaping hedges and pruning flowers that cost more per stem than my weekly paycheck. And yet, no matter how long I worked there, the feeling that I did not belong never loosened its grip on me. My life outside the gates could not have been more different. I lived in a one-room cabin behind a shuttered gas station, the kind of place where the floorboards creaked constantly and the heater coughed for 10 minutes before producing any warmth. My mother was sick, and her medical bills stacked up on the kitchen table until they looked like a second wall. I worked nights at a warehouse just to keep the lights on, and every time I looked at my paycheck I felt the same thud of helplessness. Debt had a way of pressing down, not unlike the gray sky that hung over the estate on the day everything changed. It wrapped around my throat, told me to keep my head down, reminded me that people like me did not get second chances. Inside the estate, that hierarchy was carved into every rule and every glance. Groundskeepers stayed outside. Housekeepers stayed inside. Chefs worked in the kitchen wing. Drivers remained in the garage. And none of us were allowed to cross into the main living quarters unless summoned. We were expected to walk quietly, answer briefly, and never forget that the Harrington family lived several floors above us. Not just literally, but in every other sense, too. If Grant Harrington passed by, we were to step aside, drop our gaze, and wait until he moved on. He was a tall man, always dressed in black or navy, with a silence about him that felt heavier than the suits he wore. People said he had not smiled in years, not since his wife died, and although no one spoke about it directly, we all sensed that grief lived in the walls of that house, like a permanent resident. The staff rarely spoke above a whisper. Conversations were short-clipped and cautious, even laughter felt like a breach of contract, and then there was the eerie quiet that filled the hallways, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like something wounded had settled into the floors and refused to leave. I often wondered if Ariel felt that same quiet, that same heaviness. She moved through the estate in ways that made her seem almost ghost-like silent, not just because she had never heard sound, but because no one dared disturb the fragile bubble of stillness surrounding her. Watching her from the gardens, I sometimes felt a strange connection to her, not because we shared anything in common, but because both of us lived in worlds built by people, above us worlds, where our voices mattered less than the rules written by others. And yet, even with all those rules and all that silence, the estate felt alive in ways I could not articulate. The windows gleamed as if polished with sunlight. The stone archways curved like the spines of old storybooks. And every now and then, when I caught a glimpse of Ariel standing on a balcony or walking through the lavender fields, it felt like there was a pulse beneath the estate's perfect exterior, something restless, something waiting. But I knew my place. I was a gardener. I was not meant to touch that pulse, not meant to be seen, not meant to play any part in the life of the girl whose world stood several levels above my own. Yet, as I worked among the roses, wiping sweat from my forehead and listening to the distant hum of a life I would never enter, a quiet truth began to form in the back of my mind. Sometimes the ones closest to the ground notice things no one else does. I did not know then how literal that truth would become. I used to think that wealthy people were shielded from the kind of pain the rest of us carried, that money worked like a barrier against the blows life could deliver. But the longer I worked at Ridgewood Estate, the more I realized how wrong that assumption was. In the early mornings before the staff arrived and before the sun had warmed the stone walkways, I often saw Grant Harrington standing alone on the balcony outside his private study, his posture rigid and his hands gripping the railing as if he needed the metal to anchor him to the earth. He would stare toward the east wing, the wing where Ariel's room was, and sometimes a movement in his shoulders betrayed something I never expected to see in a man like him: fear. Not the kind of fear that comes with danger, but the quieter, heavier kind that grows from heartbreak, from the knowledge that nothing you do is ever enough. It was strange to watch a billionaire look that helpless. Strange and strangely humanizing. Word around the estate was that Grant had once been a different man. Happier, lighter, a man who laughed loudly and filled the halls with music, a man who took his wife on spontaneous trips to anywhere she wanted simply because he could. People said he adored her, and that when she became pregnant with Ariel, he treated her as though she were carrying the whole world inside her. But the world has a way of breaking even the strongest people. His wife died during childbirth complications, they called it, though no one ever spoke about the details. What mattered was that Grant walked into that hospital expecting to bring home 2 voices and left carrying only 1. And the one he brought home did not make a sound. Ariel was born into silence, born without the ability to hear her father's voice, her mother's lullabies, or even the steady rhythm of her own breath. The doctors told Grant it was permanent, irreversible. They told him to prepare himself to accept the reality he had been given, but acceptance is easier to demand than to live. Grant refused to settle for silence. He flew Ariel to specialists around the world, from clinics in Switzerland with windows overlooking frozen lakes to research hospitals in Tokyo where machines cost more than most houses. He spent money like it was water, hoping it would melt the walls around her silence. I heard a housekeeper whisper once that the amount he had spent trying to cure Ariel's deafness could have fed a small town for years. But none of it worked. When the news came back the same every time something in him fractured. He withdrew from the world. Meetings were held through assistants. Invitations were declined. The estate became a place where the curtains stayed drawn more often than not, and his daughter's silence seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. Still, every morning he stood on that balcony staring at her window, waiting as though one day a miracle might drift out like morning light. I noticed these things in the quiet moments between trimming the hedges and watering the lawns. I could not say why I paid attention, only that there was something in Grant's posture that reminded me of my mother during the worst nights of her illness, when she would sit at the edge of her bed with her hands wrung together, whispering prayers she was not sure anyone heard. Watching him felt like intruding on something private, but it also made him less like the untouchable figure everyone feared and more like someone wrestling with the same helplessness I carried in my own chest. I knew what it meant to lose someone you loved. I knew what it meant to come up against a wall no amount of effort could break. My younger brother Samuel had been sick for months before he died, his breath rattling in ways that haunted our house long after his voice was gone. I remembered sitting by his bed wishing I could do anything to stop the decline. But I had been powerless then, just as Grant was powerless now. Maybe that was why I saw his grief even when he tried to hide it. Maybe that was why, whenever he turned away from the balcony and retreated into his study, I found myself staring after him longer than I should have, wondering how a man with everything could look so hollow. His pain did not excuse his distance or the strict rules he enforced within the estate, but it explained the shadows beneath his eyes and the way he flinched ever so slightly when someone mentioned Ariel. He was a father living inside a wound that had never healed, and the cruelest part was that the wound cried out every time he looked at the person he loved most. The world saw him as powerful, untouchable, a giant who built empires from steel and ambition. But what I saw in those quiet early mornings was a man drowning silently, unable to save the one person he would give anything to protect. It was a burden no one else saw. No one except me. The first time I saw Ariel up close, I was trimming the lavender beds behind the east wing, the ones that lined the old music room no one used anymore. The windows were tall, framed by peeling white paint, and always looked a little fogged even on clear days. I had just stood up to stretch my back when movement caught my eye through the dusty glass. She was inside, standing perfectly still beside a grand piano covered with a linen sheet, her fingers lightly touching the keys beneath the fabric as if she were trying to feel the echoes of notes she had never heard. The light from the window fell across her face, catching the faint shadows beneath her eyes and the slight crease in her brow. A crease I would come to recognize as the mark of a girl living inside her own quiet battle. There was something haunting about the way she held herself, not fragile exactly, but suspended, as though she were always listening to a world she could sense but not reach. I remember the way her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in every detail, every vibration in the air. Deafness had not dulled her awareness. It had sharpened it, honed it into something almost fierce. And yet, beneath that sharpness, I thought I saw something soft, too. Something hungry, not for sound itself, but for connection, for belonging. She turned her head then, and for a split second our eyes met through the cloudy glass. I froze. She didn't startle or look away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying me the way someone might study a bird perched on a branch, curious, unsure, but quietly drawn in. It was the first moment in my life when I felt seen by someone who lived in a completely different world from mine. After that day, I began noticing her everywhere. Sometimes she walked along the stone path that wound through the roses, her bare feet brushing fallen petals, her fingers grazing the tops of blossoms as though she were reading them like Braille. Other times she sat on the low wall near the north lawn, sketching something in a little journal she kept tucked under her arm. Every time she moved, she carried with her an aura of stillness that seemed to hush even the wind. But as quiet as she was, as gently as she moved through the estate, there was a restlessness beneath her calm exterior. And it showed most clearly when the breeze picked up. Whenever the wind blew strongly across the fields, she would visibly tense, lifting a hand to her left ear and pressing her palm against it. It was a small gesture, but it was filled with something I recognized instantly: discomfort. Pain, even. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would overlook, especially those who assumed her silence was her only burden. But every time I saw her wince, I felt a twitch of concern in my chest, the same twitch I used to feel when my little brother Samuel would put a hand to his ear during the weeks before we found out he had an infection. That similarity lodged itself in me the way a seed buries itself in soil, quietly at first, then deeper and deeper, the more it is ignored. The moment that changed everything came on a warm afternoon when I was kneeling near the rose hedge closest to the fountain. I heard light footsteps behind me and turned to see Ariel walking toward me carrying a thin scarf embroidered with tiny white flowers. She must have dropped it earlier because, as she approached, the scarf slipped from her fingers and drifted to the grass between us. Instinctively, I reached for it at the same time she bent down. Our hands didn't touch, but they came close enough that I felt a shock run through me, not from contact but from proximity, from the sudden awareness of her presence so close to my own. When she lifted her head, our eyes connected again, this time without the barrier of a window between us. Her gaze held mine for far longer than any rule on this estate allowed. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter mornings, and yet they held warmth too, something tender and searching. I handed her the scarf, unsure whether she would take it or recoil, but she accepted it gently, her fingers brushing the fabric as though she were reading the texture. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a wide smile, not the kind that breaks across a face like sunlight, but a small, fragile curve of her lips that felt like a secret. And then she touched her fingertips to her throat, forming a shape I didn't understand at the time. Later, I would learn it was her sign for thank you. In that moment, though, I only felt a strange tightening in my chest, as if something inside me had shifted. After that brief encounter, I tried not to think about her more than necessary, but it was impossible. Every time I saw her walking through the lavender fields, her hair lifting gently in the breeze, I felt the same quiet pull. Not romantic, not yet, but human, profoundly human. Like she was a note I had heard once in a dream and spent years trying to find again. She did not belong to silence. Anyone who truly looked at her could see that. She belonged to a world filled with sound, motion, texture, life. A world she had been kept from not by fate, but by something no one had taken the time to understand. And little did I know, I was about to become the first person who truly did. It was the way she moved that finally made me understand something was wrong, not with her silence, but with her pain. Most people assumed Ariel lived in a world without sound, and that was true, but they also assumed she lived without discomfort. They imagined silence was simply an absence, a void she had grown used to, but I had watched her too many times to believe that. It started with small things you would miss if you were not looking closely. Whenever she bent down to pick a flower or tie her shoelace, a faint tension would ripple across her face, a quick tightening around her eyes as if the world had pressed too hard against her. When the breeze swept across the fields, her shoulders would lift almost imperceptibly, and her hand would drift to her left ear, pressing gently the way a person might shield a bruise. I saw it again and again, and the more I saw it, the more something inside me stirred. One afternoon, the wind picked up suddenly, rattling the lavender stalks like tiny bells. I watched from across the lawn as Ariel paused mid-step, squeezed her eyes shut, and covered her ear. It was not a gesture of someone startled. It was a gesture of someone in pain. Pain and deafness did not always walk together, yet here they were, intertwining in ways no doctor seemed to have acknowledged. The same uneasy tug I used to feel watching Samuel surfaced inside me, sharp and familiar. I tried to push it down, reminding myself that I was just a gardener, that noticing something did not mean I had the right to act. But the noticing grew louder. It reached its breaking point the day she fell. I had been pruning the rose hedges, leaning in close to trim the new growth, when I heard a soft thud behind me, followed by the faint rustle of fabric brushing the ground. I turned quickly and saw her on her knees near the fountain, one hand gripping the stone edge while the other clutched her ear with desperate force. Her face was twisted, not in fear but agony, the kind of agony that shoots through the body before the mind even has time to make sense of it. Without thinking, I dropped my shears and rushed to her side. She did not flinch when I approached. She did not withdraw. Instead, she opened her eyes and looked at me with a raw, wordless plea that tore through every rule I had been given. As I helped her sit upright, her hair brushed my arm, light and trembling. I supported her shoulders with one hand and steadied her with the other, and that was when I saw it. For the briefest moment, as she turned her head, the angle of the sunlight allowed me to glimpse inside her ear. I saw a shadow, a dark shape lodged deeper than anything I had expected, something that did not belong there, something organic and obstructive, something that made my heart slam against my ribs because it reminded me so clearly of Samuel. Before he died, before the infection spread, before we were too late, he had done the same thing Ariel was doing now. He had pressed his hand against his ear, wincing at every movement. I remembered the way he had cried silently, how the doctors initially misdiagnosed him, how he almost lost his hearing entirely because no one looked closely enough. No one except a retired nurse at the clinic who finally caught it. That memory hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the shadow inside Ariel's ear, the dark obstruction the sun had momentarily revealed, and everything in me went still. It was not just deafness. It was not just silence. It was something more, something that could explain the pain, the tension, the sudden collapse. A blockage, a foreign mass, something no one had noticed because no one looked closely enough. A gust of wind swept across the lawn, carrying the scent of roses, but all I could smell was the sterile clinic where Samuel had once sat trembling beneath my hands. Ariel's breathing steadied as I supported her, but she was still shaking, still pressing her palm to her ear. And as her eyes met mine again, confusion flickering in them like a candle trying to stay lit, the truth rooted itself inside me like a seed thrust deep into the soil. She was not just born into silence. She was trapped by something that should not have been there at all. And for reasons I could not explain, I knew I was the only one who had seen it. I could have pretended I saw nothing. That would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing, the thing every rule on the estate silently demanded of me. But the image of that dark obstruction inside Ariel's ear clung to my mind like a stain that refused to wash out. Even when she stood again brushing dirt from her dress with trembling hands and offering me a small, shaky nod before walking toward the east wing, I felt as though a part of her pain had lodged itself beneath my skin. I picked up my shears again, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The roses blurred. The world blurred. All I could think about was Samuel. I saw him as clearly as if he were standing next to me holding his ear, his face pale with the same bewildered hurt I had just seen in Ariel's eyes. I remembered how the doctors dismissed him at first, how they insisted his symptoms were nothing more than a mild infection, how they overlooked the blockage swelling inside his ear canal because it was easier to assume than to look deeper. And I remembered how that assumption cost him everything. The memory twisted inside me until I felt physically sick. So, when Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, appeared behind me with her usual rigid posture and clipped words, her voice hit me harder than it should have. She didn't raise her tone. She never did, but the sharpness of her warning sliced straight through me. She told me not to look at Ariel for too long, not to linger near her, not to forget that the estate had rules for a reason. Groundskeepers stayed in the gardens. They did not become involved in the affairs of the family. They did not cross boundaries. They did not interfere. And above all, they did not mistake proximity for permission. As she spoke, I felt my jaw tighten, but I forced myself to nod. It wasn't fear of losing my job that silenced me. It was the knowledge that if I said the wrong thing, if I let even one flicker of concern cross my face, she would sense it, report it, and shut down any chance I had of helping Ariel before I even understood what helping her meant. When she finally walked away, the weight of her warning lingered like a hand pressed against the back of my neck. I finished watering the lavender, cleaned the tools, locked the shed, and headed to the cabin behind the old gas station where I lived. But even after I closed the door and collapsed onto the cot that passed for a bed, I couldn't escape the image of that shadow inside Ariel's ear. I stared at the ceiling until the cracks began to look like maps pointing toward a decision I didn't want to make. My mother coughed softly in the next room, and the sound pulled me back to reality. Her medicine bottles were lined up on the kitchen counter, their labels worn from overuse, each one a silent reminder of the bills I could barely afford. I could not lose this job. Without it, I wouldn't be able to pay for her treatment. Without it, everything I'd been fighting to hold together would collapse. Yet, the idea of doing nothing, of pretending Ariel's suffering wasn't real, burned in my chest like a slow-moving fire. I sat it there in the dim light, caught between responsibility and conscience, between survival and something deeper. I found myself whispering the same question over and over without meaning to. What am I supposed to do? The silence of the cabin felt thick, suffocating. It pressed against me the way the estate's silence pressed against Ariel. Eventually, I stood and paced the small space, running my hands through my hair. I could not go to Grant. He would never listen to a gardener. Even if he did, what would I say? That I, with no training and no authority, had seen something world-class specialists had missed for 18 years. That I knew something was wrong because I once watched my brother die from something similar. My voice would never carry enough weight for a man like him. And then there was the other truth, the one that haunted me no matter how many times I tried to bury it. I had overheard the doctor, not deliberately, not because I was snooping. I had been standing near the window of the estate's medical room on a stormy morning, cleaning up branches the wind had knocked down. The window had been open just enough for voices to drift out. The doctor's tone had been casual, almost bored, as he told the nurse they would not perform surgery because it was pointless, that they should continue the same therapy, that the father could afford it. That sentence had lodged itself inside me like a splinter. The father can afford it. Not the father needs it. Not the daughter requires it. Just the father can't afford it. I had walked away from that window with a knot in my stomach that tightened each time I remembered those words. Now, with the image of Ariel clutching her ear etched into my memory, that knot pulled tighter still. I dropped onto the edge of the cot, buried my face in my hands, and let out a long, trembling breath. If I helped, I risked everything. My job, my future, my mother's health, my freedom. If I did nothing, Ariel would continue to suffer, trapped by something that should not have been there at all. I felt the decision pressing down on me heavy as the sky had been earlier that day. I closed my eyes and whispered the question again. What am I supposed to do? But this time the silence felt different. It felt expectant, as though something inside me already knew the answer even if I wasn't ready to speak it. And that terrified me more than anything else. The day it happened began like any other, which is what unsettles me most when I think back on it. Nothing in the air warned me that everything was about to fracture. The morning sun rose softly over the estate, filtering through the lavender fields in ribbons of gold. I had been trimming the lower branches of the willow near the fountain, trying to lose myself in the quiet rhythm of work the way the snip of the shears could silence thoughts I didn't want to face. But even as I worked, a restless tension kept coiling in my stomach. I kept glancing toward the garden path that led from the east wing, the path Ariel often walked in the afternoons. It wasn't time for her to appear yet, but something in me felt alert, like the moment before a storm rolls in. The breeze picked up around noon, carrying the familiar scent of lavender and wet earth. I wiped sweat from my forehead and bent down to gather fallen branches when I heard a sound behind me. It wasn't loud, just a soft shift of weight against gravel, but it was enough to make me turn. Ariel was walking toward me. Her steps measured her hands folded loosely in front of her. At first, I thought everything seemed normal, but as she drew closer, I saw the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes glistened with a faint sheen of discomfort. She pressed her hand to her ear again, the same ear that had haunted my thoughts for days. I set down my tools and straightened slowly, my pulse rising. I wanted to ask if she was all right, but I couldn't speak to her without breaking the rules. Before I could decide what to do, she swayed. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment she was standing, the next her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the lavender-lined path. I heard her breath hitch, saw her shoulders curl inward, as though her body were trying to shield itself from the pain ripping through her. Every rule, every warning, every line I had been taught not to cross evaporated like fog in sunlight. I sprinted toward her. The cameras watched everything, but in that moment I didn't care. When I reached her, she was trembling, her eyes squeezed shut, her hand clutching her ear with desperate force. I knelt beside her, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it felt like it might break through. I moved my hand slowly toward her, giving her every chance to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, her fingers found my wrist, holding on with a weak, trembling grip. It was the first time she had ever touched me deliberately. Something in her expression cracked open, and I knew she wasn't just hurting. She was scared. I lifted my free hand, my fingers forming the simple sign I had practiced quietly after work, the one I hoped she might understand. Pain. She opened her eyes just enough to see it, then nodded, her face contorted with a grimace that hit me like a blow. She trusted me. That realization struck deeper than anything else. I leaned closer, my voice barely a whisper, even though she couldn't hear it. "Let me look." I hoped she could read the intention in my eyes. For a moment she hesitated, fear flickering through her expression like a candle guttering in the wind. But then she nodded again, her hand falling away from her ear as if she were surrendering her last defense. I swallowed hard and gently brushed her hair aside. My fingers trembled as I tilted her head toward the light. The garden seemed to hold its breath. Lavender stalks stilled. Even the birds grew silent, as if the world itself understood the weight of what was happening. Then I saw it. Even deeper than before, larger, darker, swollen against the delicate walls of her ear canal. A mass that pulsed faintly with each beat of her racing heart. It was unmistakable. It didn't belong there. It had never belonged there. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just discomfort. It wasn't just silence. It was something dangerous. Something that had been missed, ignored, misdiagnosed. Something that no one had taken the time to see. Except me. Ariel whimpered softly, her fingers curling in the fabric of my sleeve as another wave of pain hit her. I felt the helplessness rise inside me like a tide, the same helplessness I had felt holding Samuel's hand as he cried into his pillow. But, unlike then this time, I wasn't powerless. My hands, trembling though they were, could do something, and yet a different fear tore through me. If I acted, I risked everything. If I didn't, she would continue to suffer. I looked at her again, at the trust shining through her tears, and my decision stopped being a decision at all. That was the moment everything inside me broke open, the moment I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Everything inside me told me to stop. Every rule, every warning, every instinct for self-preservation screamed that what I was about to do was impossible, forbidden, reckless beyond measure. But none of those things mattered when Ariel's fingers tightened around my sleeve, her breath shaking against the pain building in her ear. I could feel her trembling through the fabric, feel the unspoken plea that radiated from her like heat. I had never been trusted like this before, not by anyone, and the weight of that trust both steadied and terrified me. I glanced toward the security cameras mounted on the stone walls. Their black eyes stared back, unblinking, recording everything. If anyone saw what I was about to do, I would be fired before sundown, escorted off the property, maybe even arrested for laying hands on the Harrington heiress. But as I looked down at her curled beside the lavender bed, tears clinging to her lashes, her hand pressed desperately to her ear, I knew that walking away was impossible. Not after seeing what was inside. Not after knowing she was hurting. Not after she asked me for help without using a single word. I reached into the leather pouch clipped to my belt, the small kit I carried every day in case a rose thorn pierced my skin or a splinter lodged itself in my palm. Inside were tweezers, small scissors, disinfecting wipes, bandages. Nothing meant for ears. Nothing meant for miracles. As my fingers closed around the tweezers, a cold tremor rippled through me. My hands were sweating, my breath growing shallow. I wiped the tweezers down with an alcohol pad until they nearly slipped from my grip, then forced myself to steady my shaking fingers. When I looked back at Ariel, she was watching me with wide, frightened eyes, but there was something else there too. Trust. A trust I could not afford to betray. I leaned in closer, speaking softly even though she couldn't hear a word. "I'm going to help you." I prayed she could see the promise in my expression. Slowly, gently, I brushed her hair aside again. Her pulse fluttered beneath her skin like a trapped bird. I tilted her head to catch the light, and the dark obstruction inside her ear seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. It was larger than before, swollen, pressing against the walls of her ear canal. My chest tightened. This wasn't just debris. It wasn't wax. It wasn't something harmless. It was something that had been missed, overlooked, allowed to grow inside her for years. I swallowed hard and brought the tweezers closer, my fingers trembling so violently I had to pause and take a breath. Lavender filled the air. The wind brushed against the garden walls, and for a moment the world seemed to wait. When the tip of the tweezers touched the edge of the obstruction, Ariel flinched, a soft cry escaping her. She grabbed my wrist, fear swirling in her eyes. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then I saw something change in her expression, not trust exactly, but a surrender born of desperation. She released my wrist and nodded once, tiny and trembling. "Go on." I inhaled sharply and returned the tweezers to the mass. I pressed gently. The resistance was immediate and sickening, a heavy pressure pushing back against me. My stomach twisted. If I pushed too hard, I could hurt her. If I hesitated, I could fail her. My hands shook with the memory of Samuel crying, clutching my arm while the infection throbbed inside him. I blinked the memory away and focused on the girl in front of me, on the pain etched across her face. I adjusted my grip and tried again this time, sliding the tweezers a fraction deeper, finding a slight ridge in the obstruction. I hooked it carefully, praying under my breath. "Please, please." The wind rustled the lavender, sending tiny purple petals drifting across the ground like falling snow. Ariel's breath came in shallow gasps. Sweat beaded on my forehead. Then, with a soft, sickening shift, the mass moved. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pulled back slowly, carefully, terrified of hurting her. The object resisted again, clinging to the walls of her ear. I repositioned, tightened my hold, and pulled a second time. This time it shifted more. Ariel let out a broken sound, half cry, half gasp, her hand digging into my sleeve. "It's almost out," I whispered, though I didn't know if I was trying to reassure her or myself. One more pull. I could feel the mass sliding free inch by inch until suddenly it released all at once, slipping from her ear and landing in my palm with a soft, wet thud. I stared at it stunned. A dark, dense obstruction larger than anything I had expected, slick with oil and time. Years of build-up, years of silence, years of pain. It sat in my hand like a piece of her past made physical. I looked up ready to check on her, ready to apologize, ready to face whatever came next. But Ariel was already reacting. Her eyes flew open wide, her breath caught. She sat up straighter, her body trembling violently, her gaze darting to the trees overhead as if she sensed something unseen approaching. And then she gasped. A sharp, startled sound. The kind of sound someone makes when the world bursts open in front of them. Her hand flew to her throat, her eyes filled with awe, confusion, fear, joy, emotions colliding so fast they became indistinguishable. She turned toward me, her lips parting. I watched her chest rise, then fall as though she were listening to the rhythm of her own breath for the first time. The breeze swept through the garden, rustling the lavender in a soft wave. Ariel jerked her head in that direction, eyes widening as the sound reached her. Then she heard something else. A bird chirped from the branch above us. A bright, crisp note cracked through the air like lightning. Ariel gasped again, louder this time, clutching her chest as though the sound had pierced straight through her. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She looked at me trembling. "I hear something." Her voice was raspy, barely shaped as though her vocal cords were learning to move for the first time. I felt my knees buckle, my vision blurred. I had to brace my hand on the ground to keep from collapsing. My heart raced so fast it felt like it might break through my ribs. She heard something. She heard something. She heard something. The phrase repeated in my mind like a heartbeat. Ariel reached toward me, touching her fingertips to my wrist as though testing the texture of sound in the air between us. She inhaled deeply, her breath shaking, and whispered again. "I hear something." I swallowed hard, emotion rising so fiercely I nearly choked on it. "That's the garden," I whispered. "That's the world." She looked around slowly, her expression filling with childlike wonder. Every new sound seemed to strike her like a revelation. The flutter of wings, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car. And then she turned back to me, her gaze softening in a way I will never forget. A way that made the entire garden feel suddenly sacred. I stared at the object in my hand, the obstruction that had stolen her hearing for 18 years, and felt a chill move through me. This small thing, this forgotten thing, had held her captive in silence. And I, someone no one ever looked at twice, had freed her from it. Nothing would ever be the same again. For a moment the world stood still, suspended between the impossible and the inevitable. Ariel sat in front of me, tears streaking down her cheeks as she clung to the fragile miracle blooming in her ears, her breath trembling as she tried to understand the new sensations unraveling inside her. I should have had time to breathe, to cry, to fall to my knees in gratitude for what had just happened, but fate did not give us even a heartbeat of peace before everything shattered. A sharp crackle sounded from the path behind us, the sound of gravel shifting beneath heavy boots. I turned instinctively, my pulse leaping into my throat. 2 security guards were storming toward us, their expressions hard with suspicion, confusion, and a kind of protective fear that came from being responsible for the safety of a billionaire's only child. I didn't even have time to stand before they reached us. The first guard grabbed my arm and yanked me backward with such force that I nearly dropped the obstruction still clenched in my hand. The second guard pulled Ariel away from me, lifting her under her arms as though she were fragile glass. She cried out a raw, broken sound that sliced through the air like a blade. Both guards froze. They looked at her, then at each other, as if the earth had just tilted beneath their feet. But disbelief did not slow them for long. The guard, gripping me, tightened his hold, twisting my arm behind my back until pain shot up my shoulder. The other one demanded to know what I had done to her, his voice tight, his fear translating instantly into anger. I barely managed to shout that I had helped her, that she was hurting, that I hadn't touched her, except to stop the pain. But my words tumbled out in frantic gasps, useless against the tidal wave of panic sweeping across the garden. Ariel reached for me. her hands shaking as she tried to push past the guard holding her. She attempted to speak again, the syllable fluttering weakly from her throat like a bird learning to fly for the first time. "Stop!" But the guard didn't understand. Or maybe he didn't believe it. He held her back, his grip firm, his authority absolute, and then everything went from bad to catastrophic. Grant Harrington himself appeared on the stone path, striding toward us with a fury I had never seen in any man. His face was white with terror. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles trembled beneath his skin. When he saw me, restrained disheveled blood on my fingers and the tweezers still lying in the grass, something inside him snapped. He didn't hesitate, not even for a second. He shouted my name, or maybe he shouted at me. The world had become too chaotic for me to tell. He rushed forward, pushing one guard aside as though he weighed nothing. He grabbed Ariel, pulling her into his arms, his hands searching frantically for injuries. She tried to speak to him, her fingers tapping his arm in a desperate attempt to communicate. But he wasn't listening. He couldn't listen. Not when the sight of her trembling in front of him tore open every wound he had carried for 18 years. Then his eyes fell on my hand, the hand still holding the dark obstruction I had pulled from her ear. His face drained of color. His reaction was instantaneous, violent, instinctive. He lunged at me, shoving me against the stone fountain. The impact sent pain exploding down my spine. "What did you do to my daughter?" His voice thundered across the garden, filled with a terror so sharp it had nowhere to go except rage. I tried to explain, tried to tell him she could hear that she had been in pain, that I had helped her, but the words dissolved beneath the roar of his fear. The guards seized me again, pinning my arms behind me as Grant stepped back, breathing hard. Ariel pushed against her father's chest, her face full of urgency, her voice trembling as she forced out another fragile sound. "Stop!" But Grant didn't see what she was trying to show him. He saw only a groundskeeper touching his daughter Blood Tool's danger. His grief and panic drowned out everything else. "Take him to the security wing," he ordered, his voice cracking with a blend of rage and horror. "Call the police." My stomach dropped. Everything I had feared, everything I had tried to avoid, crashed down on me at once. The guards dragged me backward, my heels scraping across the gravel. I twisted to look at Ariel one last time. She was reaching toward me, her fingers trembling, her lips shaping a word she was only beginning to understand how to speak. "No," her voice broke. The sound was small, unsteady, raw, but it was real, and for the first time, Grant froze. He stared at her, his face going slack with disbelief. But before the truth had time to settle in, before he could piece together what her voice meant, the guards hauled me out of the garden, the last thing I saw being Ariel's expression collapsing into heartbreak as she watched me disappear around the corner. They dragged me through the back corridors of the estate, my boots scraping against polished stone, my wrists aching beneath the guards' iron grips. My mind felt split open, torn between fear for myself and fear for Ariel, who had stood there trembling with a newly awakened voice while the world around her collapsed. The security wing was a small concrete room tucked behind the garage, cold enough that I could see my breath. They shoved me inside, locked the door, and left me alone with the sound of my own heartbeat pounding against the walls. I sank onto the metal bench, my chest heaving, my thoughts spiraling in frantic circles. Everything inside me felt raw, exposed. I kept seeing Ariel reaching toward me, her lips shaping the word "no" with more strength than her body had allowed. She had spoken. She had actually spoken. That should have changed everything, but instead it changed nothing. No one believed me. No one would listen. I didn't know how much time had passed when the door finally burst open again. 2 men in medical scrubs rushed in, not for me but past me, barely glancing in my direction. They grabbed the tweezers I had dropped during the struggle and sealed them into a biohazard bag. They picked up the mass, the obstruction that had stolen Ariel's hearing, and placed it into a small, clear vial. When the door slammed shut again, I was left with the realization that the next people to enter the room would likely be the police. Grant Harrington was a billionaire. Men like him didn't forgive easily. Men like him didn't believe groundskeepers over doctors or their own eyes. I braced my elbows on my knees and pressed my palms against my face, trying to breathe through the crushing weight of everything I'd done. I hadn't meant to break the rules. I hadn't meant to cross a line I could never uncross. I had only meant to help her, and now I might lose everything. The door opened again. This time it wasn't guards or medical staff, it was Grant. He stepped inside slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid the air in the room might shatter around him. His face looked carved from stone, but his eyes were wild, not with rage this time, but with something closer to fear. He shut the door behind him. For a long moment he just stared at me. I felt pinned beneath that gaze, powerless and exposed. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, strained, cracked down the middle. "What did you do to my daughter?" I swallowed hard. I tried to answer, but my voice trembled. She was in pain. I saw something. I helped her. He flinched at the word helped as though it were a blow. He took one step closer. "You touched her. You operated on her. You could have killed her." The words scraped through me sharp and heavy. I didn't operate on her. I removed something blocking her ear. Something that shouldn't have been there. He shook his head violently as if refusing to hear me. "Who are you to decide that? You have no training, no authority, no right." I opened my mouth, but before I could respond, the door swung open again and a nurse appeared, her face pale with urgency. "Mr. Harrington, the doctor needs you in the medical office. Now." Grant turned sharply. "What is it?" The nurse hesitated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's about your daughter's scans." Grant looked at me one last time. Confusion and dread clashing in his eyes, then followed the nurse out, leaving the door ajar. I didn't move. Couldn't move. Minutes crawled by, stretching into agonizing fragments of time. Through the crack in the door, I heard faint voices down the hall, then footsteps, then silence. And then the door opened again. Not slowly this time, not cautiously but abruptly, as if pushed by someone whose world had just tilted off its axis. Grant stepped inside. His face was ashen. His hands shook at his sides. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it as if the strength had drained from his body. When he lifted his gaze to mine, there was no rage left, only devastation. They found a note in her medical file. His voice trembled. "Something the previous doctor wrote. I didn't breathe." Grant swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as if he were forcing the words through a locked throat. 3 years ago, a scan showed an obstruction in her left ear. A technician flagged it, recommended immediate removal. But nothing was ever scheduled. Nothing was done. I felt cold rush through me. He continued, his voice hollow. "The doctor, managing her case, he didn't tell me. He didn't tell anyone. They kept her in therapy instead. Expensive therapy I paid for. Therapy they knew wouldn't work. Because he choked on the words, because the father can afford it." The room spun. I felt the breath leave my lungs. Grant pressed his hand to his forehead, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. All these years, he whispered, they let her suffer. They let her stay deaf. They let me believe there was nothing that could be done. His shoulders shook. When he lifted his head again, something fragile flickered behind his eyes. "You saw it," he said quietly. "You noticed what they didn't. You helped her." The weight of those words crushed me. I shook my head. I wasn't supposed to. I broke the rules. I'm just a gardener. Grant stepped forward slowly, his voice soft and raw. "You are the only person who truly looked at her." His breath shuddered. "And because of that, my daughter heard my voice today." It was the first time I had ever seen a man like him stripped of his armor, stripped of his certainty, stripped of everything except grief and gratitude. He took another step, then another, until he stood directly in front of me. And then, in a moment I will never forget, the billionaire whose shadow I had lived under for months looked at me not with anger, not with suspicion, but with something painfully human. Broken apology and fragile hope. I had never seen a man collapse without falling, but that was exactly what Grant Harrington did in front of me. He stood there for a heartbeat, shoulders squared the way men in power always hold themselves, as if posture alone could keep their world from crumbling. But then something inside him buckled. His breath broke. His gaze lowered, and before I could understand what was happening, he sank to his knees. Right there on the cold concrete floor of the security room, the billionaire everyone feared folded in front of a gardener no one noticed. The sight rooted me to the bench. For a moment, I thought he might be collapsing from shock, but then he lifted his hands shaking and pressed them to his face. When he finally looked up, his eyes were raw, red-rimmed, stripped of every layer of authority he'd worn like armor. "I'm sorry," he whispered the words, sounding as though they had been dragged out of the deepest part of him. I stared at him, stunned into silence. No one apologized to people like me. No one knelt for people like me. But here, he was a titan of industry kneeling on a cold floor because the truth had cracked open everything he believed about the world, about medicine, about himself. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he continued. I trusted them. I trusted their degrees, their machines, their words. I trusted that they were doing everything they could for my daughter. His throat tightened around the last word. Daughter. He looked away for a moment, breathing unevenly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost breaking. I didn't trust my own eyes. I didn't trust my instincts. I didn't trust... He inhaled sharply. I didn't trust her. That admission cut deeper than any accusation he'd thrown at me earlier. He lowered his head again, and I could see the muscles in his jaw trembling. All these years, he said, his voice shaking. All these years she tried to tell me something was wrong, and I thought it was just her condition. I thought the silence was all she would ever know. I watched him struggle for breath, the weight of his guilt pressing down so hard it looked physically painful. And then he lifted his eyes to mine again. You saw it. You noticed what no one else did, even when you weren't supposed to. I didn't know what to say. I had never been the center of anyone's gratitude, let alone a man like him. My voice felt trapped somewhere in my chest. I wasn't trying to disobey the rules, I managed to say. I just wanted to help her. His expression softened, not in pity, but in something deeper, something close to reverence. Rules should never matter more than a child suffering, he said quietly. You understood that even when I didn't. He shifted slightly, lowering himself more fully as though grounding himself. Seeing him like that, kneeling in a place meant to punish and intimidate, shook me. No one had prepared me for the possibility that the man who had just ordered my arrest might now be asking for my forgiveness. He looked down for a moment, his hands curling into fists against the floor before he spoke again, barely above a whisper. My daughter heard my voice today, because of you. The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I felt my breath catch my throat, tighten, my eyes sting. I had imagined many outcomes for what I'd done, arrest lawsuits, shouting humiliation, but never this. Never a father grieving for all the moments he thought he'd never have. Never a man cracking open because the impossible had just become real. I rubbed my palms over my face, my voice strained as I whispered I didn't want to take anything from you. I just wanted her to stop hurting. He nodded slowly, as if that simple truth broke him even further. If she trusts you, he said softly, then I trust you. The words hung in the air, warm and disarming, healing something in me I hadn't realized was broken. I felt my shoulders loosen, my breath release in a long, shaky exhale. And for the first time since the chaos began, I believed that maybe, just maybe, everything had not been ruined beyond repair. Grant rose slowly, not with the force of authority, but with the weight of a man forever changed. Come, he said, his voice steadier now. She's asking for you. The walk from the security wing to the medical room felt unreal, as though I were moving through a world made of glass, one wrong step away from shattering everything around me. Grant walked ahead of me slower than I expected, his hands still trembling slightly at his sides. He kept glancing back as if making sure I was still following, as if afraid I might disappear before we reached his daughter. The hallway seemed longer than usual, every fluorescent light humming softly, every footstep echoing in a way I had never noticed before. When we reached the medical room, Grant paused with his hand on the door, his breath catching for a moment. Then he pushed it open. Ariel was sitting on the hospital bed, her legs drawn up slightly, her hands resting gently on her lap. A pair of headphones lay beside her, plugged into a small device that played soft music. She wasn't wearing them, though. Instead, she was staring at the window, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something beyond the glass. When she saw us, her eyes brightened with a light so pure it made my chest tighten. She looked at her father first, then at me. And then she smiled, not the fragile, tentative smile I had seen in the garden, but something fuller, warmer, as though the world she had always imagined was finally beginning to take shape. Grant moved toward her, his composure breaking for a moment as he cupped her face in his hands. "Sweetheart," he whispered, barely holding himself together. She reached up and touched his cheek lightly, her fingers trembling. Then she did something that made his breath leave him entirely. She leaned forward and pressed her ear to his chest. After a few seconds, her lips parted in amazement. "My heart," she whispered. "I hear your heart." Grant's knees nearly buckled and he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that felt sacred to witness. I stood near the doorway, unsure whether to look away or remain still, caught between awe and the fear of intruding on something too intimate to witness. But then Ariel turned toward me and extended her hand. It was a small gesture, barely more than a motion of her fingers, but it held more meaning than any words she could have spoken. Grant stepped aside, nodding for me to come closer. I walked toward her slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears, the world narrowing to the way her eyes watched me, soft, steady, grateful. When I reached her, she took my hand, her fingers curling around mine. Her touch was warm, delicate, but also strangely certain, as if she had already decided what place I held in this new world of hers. She lifted my hand to her cheek, closing her eyes as though memorizing the texture of human closeness now colored by sound. Then she opened them again and whispered, "Your voice. I want to hear it." My breath caught. I felt suddenly aware of every flaw in my voice, every rough edge, every tremor, but I nodded, unable to deny her anything after all she had endured. "Hey, Ariel," I whispered gently, hoping the softness in my tone wouldn't break. Her eyes widened. A quiet laugh escaped her, light, uncertain, but real. "Warm," she said slowly, touching her throat as if feeling the vibration of her own words. "Your voice is warm." I swallowed hard, emotion rising so sharply it almost hurt. Behind her, Grant watched us with an expression I couldn't decipher at first. But then I saw it, recognition, gratitude, and something like acceptance. He sat beside her on the bed and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll always have a place here," he said quietly, looking at me, his voice thick with sincerity. "You did what no one else could. You saw what no one else saw. You gave her the world." I shook my head, overwhelmed. I didn't do it alone. She trusted me. "She trusted you," he corrected softly, "and that trust saved her." Ariel squeezed my hand, grounding me. I looked at her, and for a moment the room felt washed in a soft, golden stillness. Not silence, the opposite. It felt filled with the first notes of a life she had never been able to hear before. A nurse entered briefly to check her vitals, and for the first time in her life, Ariel jumped slightly at the sound of the door. Then she laughed again. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. When the room quieted once more, she looked up at me with a gentleness that stirred something deep inside me. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. I wanted to say something meaningful, something worthy of the miracle she had lived through, but nothing seemed enough. Instead, I squeezed her hand back and let the moment speak for itself. Eventually, Grant stepped out to speak with the doctors, leaving the 2 of us alone. Ariel turned toward the window again, listening to the soft hum of the world outside. She leaned closer to me, her shoulder brushing mine, and whispered with shy hesitation, "Stay, please." I felt something shift in the air, something small but unmistakably new. Before I walked out of that hospital room, she looked at me the way sunlight looks at morning, as though something new was beginning, something fragile, something hopeful. I was just the gardener. But sometimes the ones closest to the ground see what the world's tallest towers never notice. Sometimes the world convinces us that only experts' wealth or power can create change. But this story reminds us of something far more important. Human attention is a form of love, and love is often the first medicine a suffering soul receives. A billionaire father searched the world for answers. Yet a young gardener saw what everyone else overlooked because he chose to truly look, to truly care. And maybe that is the lesson we all need today. Miracles aren't always born from grand solutions. Sometimes they begin in quiet moments when someone notices pain others ignore. Sometimes the most life-changing act is simply refusing to walk past someone suffering. So, if this story reached you, let it be a reminder your kindness carries weight. Your